Well, I've just returned from a 3-week trip to Japan, taking 2 groups, one from a Bible college and one from a church. In taking these trips, I'm often asked if these kind of short-term mission trips are worth it. Well, today, let's explore that question. Welcome to Run with Horses. My name is Norman, and my goal is to help you thrive as a follower of Jesus. The spiritual life is both incredibly simple and potentially the most difficult part of your life. God invites you to live intentionally and on His mission. It's very cool that we get to do that together. Today, I'm joined by Susan, who's going to help me try to stay awake as I have jet lag and I'm trying to figure out which country I'm supposed to be in. So we'll think a little bit about some of the short-term missions trip experiences that we've had as both the receiving, on the receiving end and on the going end. But I want to first start by jumping back. I have been talking about the church and kind of defining what the church is and looking for a simple definition of the church that we can use particularly in church planting. Well, mission trips are by definition focused on the mission of Jesus, but are they really? How do short-term trips fit into the bigger picture of what it means to be the church? So I want to remind you of my working definition of the church. Remember, this is essential ecclesiology. It is a kind of a minimal definition. It doesn't include everything that you could possibly throw in there, but it's meant to be that basic level. If it doesn't have these things, then we question whether or not we're actually talking about the church. So, a church is a group of followers of Jesus who worship Him in spirit and truth, humbly offering their lives as living sacrifices, together living out the mission of Jesus as His witnesses to the world, by sharing the gospel and making disciples through teaching obedience to His commands as they edify and equip others to join them on His mission. So let's start by thinking of some common goals that short-term mission trips have. And I'll start by asking you went on a missions trip in 1993. That was your first one. Mm-hmm. And you went to Japan. Do you remember what your goals were on that trip?
Well, I know I had to go to churches and help raising funds, so I must have told them something, but that was a little while ago. So, I'm sure I was hoping to see what missions was like because I was open to going into missions. So it was kind of a test of sorts to see, is this for me? I also wanted to encourage the missionaries or help out however I could. That's pretty much it. I'm not sure I really thought too deeply other than that. And I don't know that anybody else told me this is what you should be striving for.
And if I understand correctly, you weren't really part of a team. You're kind of like a couple of individuals that went, invited by the missionaries to come to Japan. So it wasn't so much a church preparing a short-term missions trip, which is a little more what we're talking about today, but it still broadly fits in that category of short-term missions.
And to be fair, I did take a small class at the college that helped prepare me for the fundraising and thinking about missions trips. Mm-hmm.
So possibly we'll come back. I may forget since my brain's not working, but one of the things that short-term missions in that context does is prepare the person going for what it might look like to raise support as a missionary down the road. And that's not something that every short-term trip is trying to do, but it can be a benefit. All right, well, let's look at a few examples. I kind of looked online real quick and just found a few groups and some of their recommendations for goals for short-term trips. The first one is an article titled 4 Goals for a Short-Term Missions Trip, and you can find the links to all these in the show notes. But their first goal said that it should be to encourage the church planter, and I think in this context, they're thinking more of an American church planter, maybe not necessarily internationally. I would say it's still a good goal to have in mind when you're going to encourage the missionaries. And I know for us, we spent 20 years in Japan, and as we received different groups, one of my goals was always to try to connect them with other missionaries if possible, because they can speak English, or they might not be able to speak Japanese, and they have that opportunity to encourage in a different way because they're from the same country. They have an opportunity to use their gifts to encourage the missionary where they might not have the same ability to encourage the local church. So would you say that as a missionary on the receiving end, were you encouraged by short-term missionaries?
I usually felt like I was in charge of helping them to, be better. And a lot of them were just so young, and I don't know if they were coming necessarily to be helpful. I just felt like it was my responsibility to pour into them. I don't know if I'm sure they could have been encouraging, but that's not my first response.
Right. And I think this is true for a lot of missionaries. There are groups that come that are encouraging. I think they're likely to be the ones that include more older people.
Right.
When you think of high school groups or college groups, a lot of times the first thing you think of is not necessarily encouraging. It might be work. And for us, we started the GRIT program, Guide Recruits in Training, to maybe help focus our efforts in working with short-termers to help them to grow, to intentionally pour into them. And that's one reason why I think the first thing we think of, particularly those groups full of younger people, is how do we disciple them and help them become disciple makers and catch a vision for ministry wherever God leads them. So that was our first view of ministry for younger people. But when older people come, I think there is the potential for encouraging missionaries and their families. And even the younger people do have the potential to really encourage the missionary kids and in certain ways. But I think it's maybe harder for them. They're not quite in the same place in life. And it's easier for them to be distracted by, hey, we're in another country and this is all cool, and not really have that vision for encouraging. They can also come with their American goals and views and desires and just make things harder. So definitely to have that as a clear goal is important, but to do that well, you're going to have to prepare. And that's something we'll come back to in a minute. But certainly if the short-term trip can encourage the missionaries, that's going to be very, very helpful. I would maybe broaden that out and say even encourage the national workers, the pastors and leaders of the churches, if there was a way to really intentionally encourage them, that can be helpful. Second, they said the second goal of the trip is to expose people to the need for church planting, or in our context, missions. And that definitely is one of the things, young or old, everyone that comes to Japan pretty much goes away with that. There's a huge need here. So I think that's maybe easier to reach that goal than the first one when you say, just by being there. But we've tried intentionally to talk about that. How have we emphasized the need in Japan?
Well, either just driving around and you just don't see churches, or look at a map of our area and just say, well, there's this many people, there's only these many churches or this number of Christians. And just even visiting churches and just seeing how tiny they are compared to what we're used to in the States. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think sharing information through maps and those numbers is part of it, but then a big part of it is to personally go and visit churches and say, wow, there's a huge need here. We're not driving past lots of churches in Japan, so it depends on the context. I think some countries, there are more churches. It's a different kind of work. So the kind of mission trip, the place it's going, probably has a huge impact on this. I can really only speak from my context in Japan. There are not a lot of Christians. There are not a lot of churches. It's easy to see the need. We're not going as missionaries when there's a great need for theological education, for lots of building projects. What we need are boots on the ground, people who are building relationships and making disciples. So you see that huge need in everything that you do in Japan. I think that's the third goal, is to enlist more members into missions and ministry. And I think this flows from that second one. As you share the need for missions, one of the things that all flows out of that is having that conversation. What's your part in this? Whether it's prayer or giving, or particularly with the younger people who maybe they're not so encouraging to the missionary, just on this trip, they are very encouraging when they show that desire to come back and they begin training and they actually make it back to the country. So they become incredibly encouraging at that point in time.
Yeah, I think that's part of the excitement for me is the potential that, hey, maybe one or all of these people might come back and really be here long term, and then they would be very encouraging.
Yeah, there is such a need for workers that having just a few of them even express the interest is always helpful. So the trip that we just went on, some of the young people definitely are at least prayerfully considering what it might look like for them to be involved in missions in Japan in the future, and that's encouraging. You need more people who are praying about it and thinking about it, and then a percentage of them, hopefully, that you will end up here in the long run. This article said the final goal should be to excite the church family about the missions program, and this is talking about the sending church. And we have not often been on that end of the missions trips. So do you remember when you went, was your sending church very much a part of your missions trip?
I'm not sure I had a sending church for it because it was a personal desire of mine. So I don't know. I mean, the churches that knew me were behind me. I felt supported by them, but so maybe that's your answer.
Yeah, I know for this summer, in the two groups we had, one was from the college, so the college was behind the trip, and then one group was from a church, and the church was behind the trip, and they were part of praying for them and helping them prepare. So this definitely should be something that fits into the church's long-term vision of missions and sending out missionaries. That's part of why you do it as a church, is that in the hope that some of your young people, why would you send a high school or a college kid on a mission trip? Well, part of it should be that they catch the vision for ministry and for missions, and whether it's through prayerfully supporting it or financially support it, or God calls them into missions, that it is part of your long-term strategy to send out and support missions from your church. So definitely that is a huge part of the goal for short-term mission trips. I've looked up another article, and they had 3 objectives for short-term mission trips. And their first one is short-term mission trips grow the heart of the church for the plight of the lost and for the spread of God's greatness in the world. And this is kind of what we're talking about when people come to Japan and they see such a great need. As you drive through, as you walk through downtown. So we have spent our time in Kumamoto, and in Kumamoto there's a downtown area, so it's a decent-sized city, 800,000 people. There's a huge walking, outdoor mallish type place, and as you walk through, you just see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And if you realize that most of these people, not only are they not believers, a lot of them probably haven't heard the gospel from someone who cares about them, someone who sat down and lovingly shared the gospel with them. And there aren't a lot of people in this town who are doing that. So there's such a great need, even just in walking through that town. It should, drive you to pray and ask, God, what's my part in seeing this change and seeing these people have that opportunity? So definitely short-term trips can grow that vision for ministry and for the need. Second, they said short-term trips support gospel ministers, whether individuals or churches. And this goes back to that idea of supporting the church planners, supporting the missionaries, supporting the national workers. How do they support them? Well, what are ways, I don't know if you can think of from our summer program and from things that we've done, how have we attempted to support missionaries in national churches?
I think it gives an opportunity to invite the American people to come into whatever ministries and outreaches that you have, and gives you another excuse to, hey, let's get together, and the Japanese people that you're reaching out to, or whatever natives, you can have another opportunity to let them meet other Christians. So that's one thing. What was the question? I forgot.
How we support the missionaries are...
Yeah, I mean, we've done different projects that need a lot of hands that can make the work get done faster. That has been really helpful, just practically. I don't know. I guess it depends on the group, too.
Yeah, it depends on the group. It depends a little bit on where we are in life and ministry. But some of the things that we have done, getting together with missionaries and just, having a meal with missionaries is part of fostering this conversation so that the group is learning about the missionary and their ministry, and sometimes connecting with them so that they can maybe get their prayer letter and begin to pray for them. That can be encouraging, part of supporting them. But also, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, part of doing it well is to support the relationships that the church or missionary has, and that's kind of what you're talking about, whether it's through an English class or through having a barbecue and you have an excuse to invite people together again, maybe to hear the gospel again or for the first time. That's been something we've tried to do a lot, is use the group as an excuse to further the relationships that we have. So the group themselves might not be able to do a lot of those conversations, but they're the reason why some of our friends get together and maybe hear the gospel again, whether it's because we translate a testimony or because we're able to share that while they're here. So that's a couple of things that we've done to try to support the missionaries and the churches. Something I just would mention here, for hosting churches, it makes a big difference in how they view the team. If they see the team as a burden and they're just going to be in the way, often they are not creative in thinking of useful ways to use the group. And I think they miss an opportunity. If they see that the group is an opportunity for maybe making new contacts or developing older contacts, I think the teams have a tremendous potential to support things that are already happening or to open new opportunities, new relationships. But the hosting church, the hosting missionary, their view of the teams makes a big difference. So whether they're encouraged or supported or not, it does partly depend on the team, but it also depends on the attitude of the hosting group. Mm-hmm. The third one that this article mentioned was good short-term teams engage those who need to hear the gospel. And I would say that's often the goal. It's not always possible. In some contexts, the language barrier means that the team is not going to directly do a lot of gospel ministry. They may provide the excuse for the missionary to do it, but in some contexts, they're not themselves going to be directly engaging others in the gospel. But there are contexts and there are groups within probably every culture where they can directly do that. And we've done things like, have a Friday night cafe where we advertise that this is going to be a group of English speakers. If you speak English, you can come and talk to them. And then tell the group, feel free to share your testimony and have that opportunity to share the gospel with people who do know a certain level of English. So certainly, as there are opportunities, this is a good goal for the group, but it is just not always possible. One more thinking about short-term missions and another group's view of it. This one is called, Are Short-Term Missions Trips Worth It? And lots of views of that, but they give 3 times when short-term mission trips are not worth it. And one is when they're not missions trips. And they distinguish between missions trips and service trips. And I think there's a lot of gray here. Maybe, the work projects, construction, medical work, a lot of things that they would put on service trips support missionaries, support ongoing gospel ministry. So I don't know that I would separate those out and say that's not a mission trip. It is part of supporting the mission of Christ. Mm-hmm. But there are times when those things are the only thing, and even the hosting missionary or group is not really actively sharing the gospel either. And then it's just, then you do wonder what the purpose is. Then it is just a service trip, as this article talks about. Second, they said they're not worth it when they're disconnected from ongoing ministry. And I definitely think this is true. The ideal is for the mission trip to be supporting something the missionary, the church is already doing, or it's helping them get started with something they want to be doing. It's not just do something while they're here and then you drop it, and it's no longer continuing those relationships, or there weren't any relationships. It just was a summer project for the 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and then it's not connected to life or ministry. So I think this one's definitely true, and it can be difficult when you have a group of people who don't know the language and culture. So do you have any thoughts of how connected have our trips been with what we're doing? I know sometimes it's been easier than others.
Well, I mean, it's usually we're trying to connect them with people that we are already working with. Or if there's somebody we just barely know, then maybe try to get a way to spend more time with them. But I feel like we've tried to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for us, it has primarily been relationships we already have, or we're looking to develop new ones. So either we already have the relationship, so this is part of giving us an excuse to build that relationship, or we're looking to meet new people. So we've tried to think of ways that we can do that, and how can we use the team to open some doors for us. So once the team leaves, we try to follow up. So a good example of that, years ago, we tried something in downtown Kumoto where while the team was here, we met every Saturday morning for an English and coffee time, and we had 3 to 5 members of the group there every Saturday morning for, I forgot how many weeks, 5 or 8 weeks, something like that. Then once they left, we actually continued that exact thing for quite a while as we continued to build those relationships and make sure that the relationship wasn't just with a short-termer and wasn't just because they were there, but we tried to continue it. And some of those relationships, went on for years after that. There were a few that didn't, but it was our intention that those relationships would go on. So that's a good example where it wasn't all about new relationships. We did have a relationship with a coffee shop owner, but not some of the people that came. So we tried to build new relationships through them. So that's one way that we've tried to do that. Others are maybe indirectly, as we've offered the group to churches and say, how can you use them, and try to give them advice for, here's maybe a way to meet new people, or you have existing people that that speak English. How can you use this group to build on those relationships you already have? One more thing they listed in this article about when mission trips are not worth it, when they discourage partnership in favor of transaction. This is kind of talking about a mission trip that goes and they go, they're there short term, do their stuff, and then leave, and there's no further contact. There's no real connection between the church that's sending and the host. And the goal really is to have an ongoing relationship, and we recognize we're in this together, and how can we support each other, whether it's through ongoing prayer or future missions trips or people who are interested in coming back. So yeah, when they're disconnected, it can be a big problem. They go on and said, short-term mission trips are worth it when they support the ongoing ministries and encourage ongoing relationships. So that's just the opposite of when they're bad. We definitely want to have that. When they're connected to regular ministry through training, debrief, and follow-up. And this is something we'll come back to when we think about how to do it well. But one of the things we're going to get to in a minute, was thinking about our summer program, Grit, was how do we use the summer to help prepare people for future ministry? And I think a church or a group that's sending really has an opportunity to train, to help keep people pointed in the right direction through the mission trip. Debriefing and follow-up are a big part of that. So what did we learn, and how could we do it better? And some of that is recognize that individuals can learn things that will help them do better in the future when they have these kind of cross-cultural ministry opportunities. But if you don't talk about it and debrief, then sometimes you miss that growth that could occur in the team during the summer.
And sometimes coming back back home, the church could say, hey, now that you've been willing to go all the way across the ocean to do this, maybe you're more invested in ministry, and why don't you look at this ministry at our church and try to get involved with something different or new, or a different level of commitment.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard about is a group that went on a short-term trip like this, and they really enjoyed the cross-cultural ministry aspect of it, so they began to look in their area and say, what ethnic groups are in our area, and how can we have this same kind of relationship but at home? And I think that definitely is one of the potentials for using a short-term missions trip well. You can point out the differences in culture and see how you feel, and part of it for that person who's going to be doing cross-cultural ministry in the States is to experience that being the fish out of water and realize there are people around you who have this. How can you help them? How can you support them in that? How can you develop relationships with people who are struggling to fit in and figure out what it means to live in a new culture, in a new context? So that can be a good springboard for a ministry like that back at home. Third, it says mission trips are worth it when they challenge students to take risks and encourage them in their giftings. This is probably very much in line with our summer program that we've tried to do, where we would do things like take a spiritual gifts inventory. We would encourage them to explore how God has made them and gifted them, and how can He use that in disciple-making ministry, in missions, in their local church. And we always looked beyond just the missions trip, but God has called you to be a disciple maker and to be involved in His mission wherever you are. So how can we prepare you and encourage you and equip you to do that? And certainly the longer the missions trip is, the more opportunity you have to do some things like that. But even in a short one, you can still, as someone who's hosting or even is sending, it gives you an opportunity to bring up some conversations and have some more intensive time that you might not have when you don't have a group once a week or so. So I do like that aspect of missions trips where you have that 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks where you have longer time, longer conversations that are focused on how can I live the spiritual life well? How can I invest not just during this trip, but beyond this? So I think that's a good way to view missions trips. And when they do that, when they result in people who are more engaged back home and more aware of the mission of Christ internationally, then that's a win-win in both, in any context. Fourth, they say they provide students with a window into the universal church. And although this article is focusing on students, I would say that this is true also for the hosting churches, the churches that receive a group. Particularly think about our context. There's a huge need to understand that we're connected to the body of Christ. Welcome back. We're looking at goals of short-term missions trips, and we looked at a couple different articles and their goals. I want to summarize and maybe add a few other goals to that before we move on to the next segment. Work projects, broadly speaking, are one of the goals of missions trips, and we've done a lot of different work projects over the years, I think, both for camp, for local churches. It depends a lot on your context, though. Japan, we don't always have work projects. The 3-week trip that I was on this time had one work project, and that was doing some maintenance and cleaning for a missionary who was home on furlough, and we were staying in his house. There were no other work projects for this 3-week trip, but work projects can play an important part in mission trips.
Yeah, especially like in our context, a lot of the pastors are either really old or there are no pastors, so it's like just helping around extra projects in the church upkeep or the weeding. I mean, there's so many weeds and bamboo and just invasive species of plants. So, yeah, things like that.
You know, spring cleaning for the church. We just moved everything in the church and dust and things like that. At camp, we did some building projects and maintenance work. But if possible, those are handy things, particularly if they're ongoing projects that the church is going to have to do anyway. It can take some of that burden off the national church. Second, support missionary in relationship building. We've been mentioning this already in many different ways, just helping the missionary continue to develop contacts and build on the ones they already have. Third, encourage local churches and missionaries. Do that both through being a coworker, being alongside them and doing the work, but a lot of this is through the conversations. I do feel like high school and college groups maybe don't do this as well typically, but they can, maybe with a little more training. I try to set up the college groups and encourage them that this is part of your reason for being here. We want you to be ready to encourage the missionaries, to talk to the pastors and the leaders in the churches, and be willing to serve. But a lot of that is through listening and through conversation. Fourth, recruit new workers for the harvest. This is a big part of mission trips from my perspective. If it was only the work projects, only some of the support that they do for 2 or 3 weeks, I'm not totally sure that it would be worth it. Mm-hmm. But when you consider the long-term impact as people are considering missions, and this is part of how God draws them to the harvest field, then it is just a requirement that missionaries be involved in short-term mission trips, I would say.
Yeah, and being able to invest in them for the time that they're there, I mean, that gives you a different ministry to them too. And if they're open and teachable, then that can go a long ways toward their, step up in ministry and life and spiritual growth.
Mm-hmm. Fifth, inform and recruit prayer partnerships. I think this is a big part of short terms. As people come and they see the need, then they definitely can pray more effectively. They have personal names, maybe it's of local churches, of pastors, of members in those churches that they can pray for, of missionaries that maybe they've heard about and now they can pray for them specifically. So this is a huge part of these kind of short-term mission trips. Some of these people will become prayer partners that will pray for years and years. And I can say in our life, we've had people who were part of our short-term missions trips years ago, 18 years ago, and we still have contact with them. They still pray for us. In some cases, they support us. So God has definitely used that relationship to encourage us over the years. And the sixth one, the last one, is to give both the church going and their hosting church a better vision of the universal church. And we mentioned this a little bit already, but just to recognize we're part of something bigger, and that's true both for the church who's sending out a team. It's also for the churches that are receiving them. A place like Japan, this is a huge part of the vision for the missions trip, to recognize that this small church, maybe of 10, 12, 25 people, that you are part of God's family, and there are people who are praying for you. And I know we were able to tell some of the Filipinos that we worked with, there are people who've been praying for you for years. And it really is encouraging for them to recognize that, hey, people know we're here, people know that we're working, that we're doing this, and they love us and they care for us.
Yeah, that's huge.
So let's turn real quick before we move on to why do short-term mission trips sometimes have a bad reputation? And I'm not sure if this is true across the board or if it's only certain groups. I get asked a lot of times, are short-term mission trips worth it? But I don't think I've seen the really bad examples. I've just seen kind of maybe mediocre examples sometimes. But in some cases, I've heard of just really terrible groups of Americans going on mission trips. So they've earned a bad reputation. How's that? Well, one, they're seen as just a vacation for rich Americans. And this was not a missions trip, but years and years ago, I was working a master's in botany, and I went to Peru, and I was just thinking about doing a longer project down there. But one of the things that I did was I was waiting on a boat to go down the Amazon with some of the people I was working with, and you saw this group of American tourists come through, and they were exactly what all of the stereotypes are. They came through with big, expensive cameras hanging off their neck. They were wearing Hawaiian shirts and shorts and just they were on vacation. And they were on vacation. And that's fine. But when a missions trip group looks the same way, you can understand how that might give a bad view to the missions trip. Second, there's the view that the missions trip is very fulfilling for the team, but it's not really useful for the hosting church or the nationals or the missionaries who are there. And I think that can be true. it shouldn't be. And when we come down to our next segment, when we look at doing it well, we want to point out how not to be in that place. But it is true that sometimes the team gets a lot out of it, and it was mostly for them. And then it was just a burden for the missionaries. And I know I've talked to missionaries who don't like short-term missions trips because they've hosted so many that were, they were very good for the team, not so good for the missionary. They just cost them money and time and didn't really move any kind of meaningful mission metric. Third, no clear purpose, and this kind of connects to the earlier one, I think. If we don't have a clear purpose, then you can easily understand how you waste a lot of time, and it can end up being a sightseeing trip and just kind of a short vacation because we didn't know why we came. I know for our trip this last 3 weeks, we tried to keep it in front of everybody's mind. These are our goals. There are some limits to how well we can do other things, but here are 3 or 4 goals that we can and want to do really, really well. So when we have downtime, it's fine. We can take a hike. We can do something fun. But when it's time for these things are first. This is why we're here. So to have a clear purpose helps a lot. No clear purpose, it's very high potential for wasting a lot of time. Fourth, the team can be unprepared. And a team that's just really not prepared either for the context, so maybe the culture, or they're just not prepared. They're not the right people to be there. They're not mature. They're not really there as missionaries. They're not there on mission. They're there for other purposes. They're there to sightsee. They're there just because they wanted to go on a trip. All of those things can lead to a trip that really does waste time and waste the effort that the missionaries have.
Sometimes, too, churches want to, or parents want to send their child on a missions trip to reform them, which is also a bad reason to send them because they're really not ready for that then.
Yeah, a missions trip is not made to reform people. It's for the people who are ready to go. And I think sometimes a church does look at a missions trip as maybe a training time, which is fine if someone is far enough along and having been trained so far, but it's not necessarily the best time to begin training somebody. If they haven't really showed any interest in serving at their local church, you probably don't want to start by sending them to a mission church and see if that's going to be a better place for them. Mm-hmm. And lastly, the fifth one, why do short-term mission trips sometimes have a bad reputation? Well, they have a bad reputation because it feels like a waste of time for the missionary who is busy doing hard work, and they feel like they're wasting their time babysitting people who don't know or care about the culture, and they don't know the language, and they have no interest in learning. So a lot of reasons why trips have a bad reputation. We don't want them to be there, though. We don't want to have trips that are like that. So for us, years and years ago, we were at the point where we were new missionaries in Japan. We had just finished language school, and we were contacted about sending over a short-term group, about doing something with college kids. So we asked a lot of missionaries, what do you do? What have you done? What do you recommend? And it was kind of like what we just mentioned. Some missionaries were like, well, mission trips, you have to have them because we need to get new workers, and that is one of the ways, and we recognize that, but it's a huge waste of time. It's a hassle. It's hard. It just wastes a lot of time and money, but, you have to do it. And that was kind of the attitude from some people.
And also, like, the minimum or the most ministry you could get out of them is maybe 25% of your time.
Yeah, that was one of the things they said. About 25% of the time was ministry time. The rest of it, they end up doing sightseeing and other stuff. So we looked at it and said that does not seem like something we would be interested in doing. So we had a couple of things. Thinking about doing it well, which we're going to get to in just a second, we looked at it and said, well, how can we increase the amount of ministry time? 25% does not seem good. So looking at practical work projects, making our teams more available to more churches, not just us, that helped a lot. So we ended up with some of our trips, I would say 60 to 70% of their time was actually meaningful ministry time, meaning that we showed up at a church and we did things that needed to be done, that they wanted to do, but maybe their church membership had gotten older, so they were struggling to do some things, or they didn't have the time, or able to be involved in outreach projects where we were either handing out literature or our group was the excuse for getting people together in the community. Lots of different things like that. And we tried to have a list of ideas. So to be really creative and think about what are all the different ways a group of people who don't speak the language could potentially allow connections or allow new connections or build existing connections. So we ended up doing everything we could to maximize that time, but we're still left with what we do with the rest of the time. So for us, GRIT, God's Recruits in Training, came out of what do we do with the rest of the time, which we looked at the New Testament and said, well, we're supposed to be disciple makers, so how can we disciple them? And that's what we did with the rest of the time. So particularly in the beginning, we didn't do any sightseeing and say, well, you're in a strange culture in a new place, so going to the grocery store is probably a new experience, and that's good enough for you. So we did do some hiking and things because we required physical fitness as part of it. But our goal was to help people grow in following Christ. And how can we encourage them and help them to apply biblical truths to their life now? And GRIT was a little longer for a short-term trip, so it was 8 weeks. We usually had people in the country for somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks. And our schedule was designed around physical training. So we had 5 days a week where we did some kind of physical training, whether it was walking, jogging, calisthenics. We really wanted to encourage prayer, not just for Japan, although that was a big part of it, but also just developing a healthy prayer life. So we encouraged prayer and fasting, and one way we did that was every Monday was a day of prayer. So we didn't usually have ministry on Mondays, but instead of taking the day off and doing tourist type things, we encouraged people to fast, and we did it kind of as a corporate fast, and we spent that time in prayer. So we did prayer walks. We had individual prayer time. We used this time also to teach about things like praying through Scripture, how to pray effectively for each other, so looking at Paul's prayers, but also things like going through the missionaries and churches that we either had already met or would be meeting and praying specifically for them. So we're trying to build, it's one way of giving information. So here's specific information about this church, and now how do we pray based on what we've learned or are learning about this church? And then we had a lot of information that we tried to work through and try to do it in a very intentional, relational way where we're talking about leadership. So we had initiatives, we called them, where we would put somebody in charge and have them be a leader for us of a small group for a certain amount of time, and then we would evaluate and debrief and say, how well did you do? What could you have done differently? So we worked on things like communication, basic leadership, planning, how to give a devotional. All of the guys gave a sermon by the end of the summer. The team rotated doing devotionals at every meal. So a lot of things like that where we're trying to be very intentional about helping them grow in Christ likeness. All of that was put in and around the ministry times. We gave that first. The schedule was done by first saying, what are the churches will be active in on weekends, particularly the Sunday and the services, and how can we do that well? So our group learned enough Japanese to sing Japanese songs. We offered to do anything that the church would like for us to do. So no restrictions, that if the group can do it, whatever is helpful or encouraging to you, you tell us what will be encouraging to you and we will do that. So that means we spent time weeding parking lots sometimes or doing things
getting the gum out of the sidewalks.
Yeah, we got sometimes there were some strange projects, but if the church felt like it was something they wanted done, we tried to do it. But there were a lot of really good projects that were people-oriented as well. So doing like our Friday night English cafe or Saturday morning English and coffee or barbecues where the church just would invite people that they knew to come and meet the foreigners, just whatever that they liked. But that's how we implemented short-term mission trips, college groups. So we tried to discourage 2 and 3 week trips and say, hey, if you want to come to be part of what we're doing, this fits into our long-term strategy. We have developed relationships with these churches and these people, and here's how you can help us develop what we're doing. So I think that's part of doing it well. Now, there are a couple articles I wanted to look at thinking about doing it well, and one was called 7 Standards of Excellence in Short-Term Missions. And they said, one, I think this is really good, that it's God-centered. The goal is to glorify God in all that we do and how we do it. That's our purpose in our individual lives, but also in the things that we do, the methods that we use. I think this is huge, that our goal on the trip is always to glorify God. The second thing they mentioned was empowering partnerships. So really looking at it as not as a transaction, which you've kind of mentioned earlier, but it's not a one-time and we're done, but how do we build ongoing relationships with people? The third one they mentioned is mutual design, but the way I want to put it is the church that's sending and the missionary or church that's hosting have to work together and say, how do we do this in a way that actually fits into the long-term strategy and goals of the missionary, of the church there? So I think that is really, really important. It can't be the host church says, this is what we want to do and we want to come and just do it. Well, if that doesn't fit in with what the mission church or the nationals need, that's not a good idea. It really needs to be something that's going to benefit both. They go on to talk about the administration, so how you handle all the details, that's important. Qualified leadership, this is a big one. The trips that we've had that were the best were trips where there was clear leadership. There was somebody who was preparing the team ahead of time. Mm-hmm. Really, the way I look at this, they were discipling them ahead of time. They came on the trip, they learned more, they were continually being discipled as they were here, and then there was follow-up when they got back. Some of those trips were groups that had numbers of people who are now in ministry as missionaries or pastors. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the tremendous values of short-term mission trips done well. 6, they mentioned appropriate training, and that kind of goes in with the leadership. I think qualified leadership who have the right vision or are going to train people to accomplish the goals that they have. And then follow through. So you have just a clear way of doing follow through, and that vision for following up and making sure that the lessons learned are applied. Some of the things that the short-term team learns are applied in their home church, but also for the host to take the value of the team, the things that they brought in, and how do we follow up with that? How do we take some of the momentum that we gained from this short-term 2 or 3 week trip and meeting lots of new people? Are we prepared then to follow up and continue some of those contacts? So all of that is part of doing it well. There's another article titled, Consider These 5 Things Before Your Church Plans a Short-Term Missions Trip. Some of this is the same stuff as before. Incorporate your short-term missions into long-term relationships. So it is about the relationships that the missionaries and the church has. Recognize the value of caring for career missionaries and their families. This is something maybe we haven't mentioned, but a short-term trip really does have the opportunity to impact the missionary family. So I know our kids have benefited from a lot of the short-term teams that have come and just enjoyed those relationships and have a chance to talk to somebody in English and just have fun and have different new relationships. So I think that's been a big part of our what we've benefited from the short-term trips, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, overall. Sometimes they would bring along, things that they were really into that we were trying to keep our kids away from. So it kind of sparked their interest in worldly things. But yeah.
The third one says, ask a missionary to help you plan your activities. And this is what we mentioned before, doing that planning together. And the fourth one is leverage church partnerships for training and opportunities. And this is both for the team coming and the hosting team. You can use this as an opportunity to train, to grow, to learn, to do better in many respects, both for the sending church and the hosting church. So use this time when you're intensely planning this time period. How can we use it as an opportunity to train, to develop more people to serve? And fifth, they said invite church-wide involvement. And this really is talking about making sure that the sending church really is as much as possible involved, whether it's praying or giving funds or going on the trip, to make sure that it is a whole church project. So I have a kind of a summary maybe of some things to do it well. First, if you want to do short-term missions well, you have to have clear goals that fit in with the missionary or national church and their long-term vision and strategy. Just to go with your own goals and this is what we want to do, that's not a good way to do it. And carry that to an extreme. That means even the time that you choose. Like a lot of churches, a lot of schools say, well, this is our best time to go. Is that the best time for the missionary in the church to receive you? I've had different people ask us about trips to Japan, and I've told several people, honestly, if you'd like to do like your maximum value trip, come over your Christmas vacation and bring a music team, and they have so many opportunities to fill a gap that a lot of churches don't have the opportunity to do really good Christmas outreaches because they don't have music, they don't have the ability to do something special. But a lot of people are open to hearing the Christmas message. So if the church can provide somebody who can share the Christmas story or testimonies, but the short-termers can provide music and an opportunity to gather, that's a good partnership that can really fit in. Well, are you asking that kind of question as you prepare for your missions trip? Not just, are we going to be useful, but is the time period that we're going, do we need to sacrifice to do it at a time that's hard for us? Well, you might need to get the best missions trip. Second, take the time to train and prepare the team to be servants in all areas of life. This means, yes, whatever overt areas of ministry, but also to be observant and look around them and say, hey, there are places where you can serve where it's not necessarily what was planned or something big, but in little things, in being on time and cleaning up after yourself, and just being aware of people. How can you encourage and equip your team to be servants as they come? Anything to add to either one of those? Sorry, I'm not asking.
Well, sometimes you feel like missions trips, it's all about sharing the gospel. But I mean, if you don't know the language, you're very limited in doing that. But maybe the best thing you can do is wash the missionaries' windows, or, this saves them time to do some of those menial tasks that they just don't have time to keep up with everything. I don't know, servant's heart.
Yeah, servant's heart is huge. Third, use the opportunity to equip the team in new ways that will benefit the sending church when they return. So it gives you new training opportunities. And if you think about this and you're intentional about it, the people you want to send on your mission trip are the people who are going to be your future workers, whether they're going to be pastors or Sunday school teachers or deacons or maybe missionaries or church planners that your church sends out. How can you use this short-term mission trip to be a step for them, a stepping stone toward future ministry? And I think being intentional in that is a huge part of mission trips for the sending church. Fourth, support disciple making in both the sending and receiving church. What does that look like? Well, it depends on where your church is in disciple making, but you understand that this should be part of that process in growing toward Christ likeness for both groups, the sending and the receiving church. 5, plan ongoing evaluations and debriefings. Get the receiving church's evaluation particularly. So you want to know how well you did, you need to talk to the national church or missionary. And it may be hard to get an honest opinion because a lot of people don't want to tell you that, yeah, you just wasted our time. And you're probably not going to ever hear that unless you did a terrible job. If you hear that, we really bombed big time. But if you can get a good, honest evaluation and say, where did we do well? Where could we have done better? How could we have planned better? This is part of ongoing as your church is thinking about short-term missions. How can we do well? Well, getting those evaluations and thinking it through and applying what you learned to the next time is a huge part of it. 6, and this really should have been probably first, but pray. Spend a lot of time praying both for your team, for the nationals who are going to be receiving you, for the missionaries. Understand that God is the one who works. You may not know the language or the culture or have control of all the little details. God does, and He can absolutely work even in ways you can't imagine and didn't prepare for. Last, choose the right people for the team. You don't want to choose people who are not mature enough, who are going to make it challenging for the rest of the team or for the nationals, who are going to be always questioning what's done and the timing and don't like anything and are not willing to try the food. All those things can make it hard. So choosing the right people is a huge part of doing short-term missions well. There's probably more we could talk about, but for today, we're going to end it there and say, my evaluation is, short-term missions definitely is worth it, but it does take some effort. And it takes recognizing that this is one part of being on the mission of Christ. So thanks for joining me and Susan today. Stop and say a prayer for your church. I'd love to hear from you. Write me at norman@runwithhorses.net or leave a comment on the Run With Horses Facebook page. Take the time today and pause and thank God for His work in your life and keep running. If you have a chance for a short-term mission trip, I encourage you to take it.